the ability to share those reports and views, schedule reports to run. Those can be delivered via email, and of course, the ability to export those reports as well. So when looking at CUIC as a whole, really it's our data information center, which leads us to the next question here is what data can we report on, right? So what is it that we're looking for? The data that is there, and when we get to the architecture, you'll see it in more detail, right? The purpose of this session, but the types of data that we can report on in CUIC specifically, it's everything from real-time historical views, just to break it down into those two categories, but in more depth, we have inbound reporting, we have outbound reporting. If you have a Cisco campaign through UCCX, that it has its own reporting. If you are truly omni-channel, which is this buzzword and has been for a while, you have omni-channel reporting now, chat, email, and that's all through CUIC. And you also have system level reports and views, which we'll talk about in the architecture slide as well. So there's lots of different data that we have available to us. And I've mentioned it here, real-time versus historical. I want to make sure that there's a very clear understanding between the two. Real-time data is KPI data that is available in real time. Its purpose is to be able to monitor and keep a close eye on call center traffic, performance throughout the day, really to be as proactive with your management and supervisor roles as possible. And when I say real time, available in real time, I say that with a caveat because it really truly depends on a few different things. One, is it an event-driven data element or not? And when I mean that, right, that sounds very technical. A perfect example is an state change. In Cisco Finesse, this is something we see immediately, right? So if I am an agent and I go from ready to not ready, or I change my not code, that's something that as a supervisor through Cisco Finesse, I'm going to see immediately. Or a talk time average, that's something that instead of immediate, right, because it's not event driven, it's a rolling average, that piece of data is something we might see refresh every 3 to 5 seconds in Finesse, okay? I've thrown around Finesse, we're talking about CUIC, right? That minimum refresh rate on real-time data in that architecture, or platform rather, is between 10 to 15 seconds. And that really allows for communication between servers. And that's that's high level what we can describe real-time data as. But really, what is that compared to historical data? Historical data, of course, history recurs, references to the past, right? This is information that is being presented to us about things that have occurred in the past. Its purpose, right, as opposed to the real time, is to be able to look back at data for the day, whether it's yesterday, last week, last month, and truly to be able to analyze a larger data set, right? So an example, I'm going to go back and look at the number of calls presented to CSQA versus CSQB for last week. Real-time data would look at how many calls do I have in QA versus QB right now, right? So what's happening right now? As far as how quickly we see historical data in CUIC, it really depends on what type of record we're looking at. Some, for example, a CCDR, if you are familiar with that report, that is a call-by-call detail report in CUIC, that will update at the close of each call. Okay, so that is one record. It gets written back to the database. That writes at the close of that call, right? So when that contact is over. Some reports in CUIC historically will write every 10 minutes. And some we might be able to see 30 minutes, okay? So that's really the difference. I want to make sure that that is clear. Real time has a different purpose than historical. You can see both of them in CUIC. One is pretty quick, and the other one is pretty quick, but can have, depending on the report type, a different refresh rate. And when I say refresh rate, in historical terms, meaning that's how frequently it's going to write, that data is going to write to the database and become available in CUIC stock reports. So to move on from that, right, we have what is CUIC, we have what data can we report on, what's the real time versus the historical view, but really the fundamental purpose of this class is what drives that data. What gives us the information that we have? And a lot of the times that's what causes a lot of the confusion with CUIC reporting. So to get to the nitty gritty with that, we really talk about what drives it. And what drives that is scripting. Scripting. We have a few examples to go through. And to fully explain this, we need to first explain what a script is. The most basic explanation of a script, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is it's a Cisco coding language, essentially, that tells a call what to do after the point a customer dials your 1-800 number, but before it reaches your UCCX agent. For example, an IVR, that is, it's coding that says, press 1, press 2, collect caller entered digits. Not to get too technical with that, but it's a computer, right? So we have to tell the computer exactly what it needs to do. It's a language that has detailed instructions on what to do with each individual call. At what point do we offer this message? At what point do we offer a callback, right? We have to tell the system each step of the way, and that is referred to as scripting. And that, to understand that, of course, takes a lot, but that to understand that coding and that language drives what we see in our reports is absolutely mission critical, and that's why we have such a large stake in it in this presentation specifically. So to speak a little bit more about that, I am going to tap in David Trello for the next slide. We do have an example of a script, and we're going to speak to a very specific example of that infamous DQ, and he'll be able to speak to that, and if you have a call in more than one queue at a time. So David, I am going to hand it over to you for the next slide, and Rebecca, if you could please move over to slide 3.
Okay. Can you hear me, Brittany?
I can, yes.
Right. So like Brittany was saying, one of the key things I think a lot of people miss in when it comes to reporting is setting up their scripts properly to properly feed the reports. Everything you do in scripting, everything that is configured in the screen that you see in front of us is kind of a couple of examples, drives the outcome for reporting. We have 2 examples of 2 different scenarios that we've seen with customers, and the customer would sit there and say, "Geez, our queues look great," or "Our call volume is through the roof. We don't understand how we can have this many phone calls and this many abandoned calls and this many DQ calls." And it really is impacted in possibly the improper nesting of phone calls, or queues, or the improper checking of queue stats, and then doing something that's alternative just to first in, first out type of routing. So in this version right here, if you look at the top version, you have the flawed setup where the contact comes in, hits a queue loop, ends up jumping into a queue, and then goes into a call on hold, and then moves on through the script. We're not setting the contact properly because we're setting it as handled. We're setting it in a way that should not be, because it could fall through to the connected version of it. Down below, you'll see that we have a set contact info after the connected goes to the queue piece. So we queue for one CSQ, you queue for a second CSQ. You have to make sure that you flag one of those as the DQ'd and the other one as the handled. This is just one example that we've seen, improper tagging of phone calls, where have a flood of handled or DQ'd or a flood of just not accounted for types of calls. Now the next screen, Rebecca, if you can jump to the next one. The next screen is an actual customer that we looked at. The other screenshot, I'm sorry, for the calls that were not queued at all. Oh, I'm sorry, it must not be in here. I'll just explain it. What ended up happening is we had a customer that they were using a get reporting step for calls coming in. And what they had it set to is if there were no agents available in the queue, they would loop the call outside of the select resource step. So they would look ahead, see how many agents were in the queue, to jump into the get answered by an agent, and because the agents weren't available and they were in a talking state, the customer kept on looping the phone call, and they would only send the call to an agent if there was an agent available. So in their scenario, they actually had a working queue, but it was only sending calls to the queue if there was an agent available. So when we sat with that customer, and their feedback to us was, geez, we've got these great reporting statistics, but we have a high amount of abandon or a high amount of call volume. People don't wait in our queues. They didn't realize that they weren't letting their callers wait, because if there was no agent available, they would just send the call to an endless loop outside of a queue, or to a voicemail. So they would be sending calls to voicemail if there were no agents available. So it really skewed their statistics, and they couldn't understand it. And of course, once we fixed and implemented our queuing cycles, then everything kind of normalized. So there was one customer that thought they had this tremendous service level, and at the end of the day, they were blocking people. They were blocking calls from getting through. So once we fixed those queues and that select resource step, that look ahead type of review, it fixed everything, and everybody ran in a more realistic fashion. And the management was looking at the report saying, okay, this is more realistic. We're getting 5,000 calls a day, getting roughly 100 abandoned. We're getting a bunch of DQ'd versus why are people not getting through? Why do we have such a good queue when we're not staffed properly for our own Erlang and workforce managers calculations? So the point of this whole thing is that scripting is critical for reports. If you're going to set up your system and you have specific reporting requirements, specific service level requirements, if you're going to nest calls, if you're going to overflow to what other groups, if you're going to use DQ heavily to maybe go to a backup group, it's critical that you set up the scripts properly to reflect that information in the reports. So really, that's it. Kind of a high level of the importance of scripting behind the configuration of the system and the impact on reports. Okay, Britt.
All right. Thanks. Rebecca, could you switch? Thank you. On the ball. So just to speak a little bit more off of what David said in a more, I know that he gave you a real world example here. We want to talk through this example here that we have up in front. I'm not going to read word for word here, but for each of the scenarios, but to really truly understand what we're talking about here. And I would say, if we were in a room, show of hand, who has ever looked at a report that said handled by other and wondered exactly what does that mean, versus I'm looking at another one and it has DQ'd. What does that mean? And to truly understand that, kind of branching off of what David said and what he had there as far as the DQ'd example, is if you mark a queued contact as handled, right? We're actually going back to the computer language, right? We're telling it, mark this contact as handled. It will show in the reports as handled by other, and some that have that field. If it doesn't have that field, it's going to show as DQ'd. That's really the main difference. But to understand where that number comes in is we're physically telling the computer to report that call as a handled call. So where in just to branch off of David's example here, if you mark that contact as handled and then DQ it, it's going to have the handled by other field, and it will then show them as handled, it will still show them as handled by other. but it's going to also report as the dequeued. So just the kind of different effects of how the language behind what we're telling the computer to do will reflect on different reporting scenarios. So here in the below, right, we have scenario 1. Calls presented to CSQ1 gets dequeued, and we mark it as handled. Then that queues for CSQ2, and it gets handled there. Okay, so then CSQ1 row in the report is going to show 1 presented and 1 handled by other, right? And then CSQ2 row is going to show 1 presented, 1 handled. That's fine, but let's look at scenario 2, for example. Okay, so and again, we're kind of talking through the nested queue situation. Call presents to CSQ1. It gets dequeued. We tell it, mark it as handled. Okay, then it queues for CSQ2 and gets abandoned. Okay, I think we have somebody that's off of mute. Okay, so let's recap that, right? Call presents to CSQ1, it gets queued, right? It's going to the next queue. We mark it as handled. It queues for CSQ2, but then gets abandoned. Well, let's think about that, right? We marked it as handled. So when we look below here, right, below scenario 2, CSQ1 row will show 1 presented, 1 handled by other. CSQ2 is going to show the 1 presented, 1 abandoned. So when we look at that, right, and we put a microscope to the way that that's reporting, is it's not giving us an accurate view because we've marked it as handled in CSQ1, but truly it was not a handled contact because it ended up abandoning in CSQ2. So that's where we want to explain how these different, how the scripting affects the reporting, really, and just talk that example specifically. There are others, right? It's just kind of going back to how does this affect what we're seeing in the report. So this is one that's caused a lot of frustration for me over the years, and I wanted to take the time to explain it. I will move over to the next slide and want to kind of switch it back to the architecture here. So when we talk about architecture, it's good to understand, right? And this is why we put architecture as session 1 of the series, is because it is absolutely critical to understand what reports is going to be, which reports are going to be best for your organization. And to understand that, and to understand CUIC and its essence, is to understand what drives those reports, right? So we talked about scripting, we talked about where does the data come from, we talked about real-time versus historical, but really there's an architecture to the way that UCCX as a whole is, you know, in a very basic explanation, is how it's built, what building blocks make up that entire system. So again, this is from a reporting point of view, specifically. So to truly understand which reports are going to be best for your organization, we want to help explain what the different levels of reporting are based on your environment. So when we say UCCX and CUIC and we're throwing these words around, UCCX is a communications platform that facilitates the ability to queue or hold calls and route them based on skills and agent availability. And when we say picking the right reports for your environment, each customer out there is tailored a little bit differently based on your needs. And that is why we see 2 different examples here, is because it's not really a one size fits all, right? UCCX, that communications platform, is an extremely flexible technology that allows us to truly build things the way that you need them built. So in the example here that you're seeing, we'll talk through each of these. You have sample A versus sample B. Sample A is made up of multiple applications, whereas sample B has one main application. And what I mean by that, and Rebecca, I am going to ask to control so that I can use your lovely pointer. There we go. Thank you. Okay, so if I'm up here in sample A, right, and I mentioned this has multiple applications, this has a single application. what I mean by that, okay, and as it relates specifically to reporting, you have different reporting levels, okay? Over here on the left-hand side, you have different levels of reporting. That directly relates to what it is truly that we're reporting on, okay? Are we reporting on system level? Okay, system level is UCCX. Again, that's the entire communications platform and of those calls that are going to be those queued calls, right? Those automatically delivered or distributed calls, right? Those are the phone calls I'm talking about. And when we talk about UCCX as a whole, it's all of the calls coming in to the UCCX at a system level. Okay, on the right-hand side, we do have a few examples of what that would be. So in CUIC, I can go and pull a traffic analysis report. This is going to be a system level report. It's going to give me the amount of inbound contacts to my entire system. Whereas if we look at the next level of reporting, right, we want it a little bit more granular. We're going to look at the application level. Okay, the application level, first we want to explain what an application is. We showed you what a script was, right? We talked through that. A script is, it's the coding, it's the language that we're using to tell a call where to go, right? We point an 800 number to an application. Okay, it goes through UCCX, it goes to an application, and then it triggers off that script, that language, which then gets distributed. Okay, so we can think of this as a filter. Calls come in through the top and they are distributed to where they need to go, right? So they come into UCCX and they go to the associated application that we need them to go to. In this example, let's say that you have a main 1-800 number, but you also have a number that is an 800 number direct to sales, or you have an 800 number that is direct to service. Alternatively, you can have calls come in right through UCCX to your main menu that are then transferred to other applications to kick off other scripts. So we have here, just as a very basic example, we have a main menu application. Some customers have multiple applications where they have a main menu. That's where our IVR is, right? I select option 1 for sales. Then I have a few other menus within sales. So I go to a full-on sales application. Okay, so this is where we would be reporting at an application level. I have calls coming in, and as somebody who's looking at the reports, I want to see how many calls came into the main application today. How many of those calls went to sales, right? How many of the calls coming in today went to service? That is an application level report. Okay, it's not the entire view. So if I look at main in this example, it's not the entire number of calls coming into the system, and it does not tell me how many calls went to queue. That's a different level, right? So these are calls that, let's relate it back to the IVR. How many people heard my main menu today? We can think of it that way. And a good example of that would be an application summary. Okay, so CSQ level reporting. Let's talk about how we get there. Okay. Let's talk about sales, right? Let's go through the example of I am calling a 1-800 number. I hit, right? So a phone call comes in, if you follow my lovely pointer, call comes into UCCX, it hits the main menu application. As a caller, I hit option 1 to go to sales. I go over to sales. Well, sales is the application, it's not the CSQ, right? So if I want to know how many calls went to the sales CSQ, I'm going to need to look at the sales CSQ itself and not sales as an application, because maybe I have a sales CSQ. Maybe I have a sales return CSQ. Maybe I have a general questions for sales specifically CSQ. You can have multiple CSQs that are associated with one application. So in order to see CSQ level, I need to look at CSQ level reporting. And to understand, right, the difference between these two, they start in an application, they filter down. So in order to look at the CSQ itself, I'm going to look at a CSQ level report, knowing that the total number of calls that came into sales are not necessarily the total number of calls that went into the sales CSQ. A lot of people would like to add these together, but it's highly possible for us to get to a sales menu and abandon before we get to it. The CSQ level reporting is only going to have a presented call to a CSQ if the scripting tells it to queue for that CSQ. So it does not become a queued call until it is in and waiting for an agent in the queue. And that's very important to note because there are some people out there that will look at an application level report and think that this is a direct correlation with how many calls went to CSQ, and they're very different. So I wanted to make sure, and that's the whole purpose of this architecture, is to make sure that we understand truly the number of calls coming in and why they're going into where they're going. So look at this, right? We have application level, we have CSQ level, right? An example, a few of really good example reports here. We have a CSQ all fields report, which is literally going to give you all of the fields associated with a CSQ level reporting. So if we pull a CSQ level report for sales, it's going to give you everything from the average handle time, so to the max DQ for the day, and everything in between. It's a very high level, detailed level report, which is great. So it's one of my favorites to use because I have everything in one view. Another good one is a contact service queue activity report that has a lot of good data in it as well. So then let's talk about what happens at the end of a queue, right? Where does it become not a queued call anymore, and where does it hit the agent? At the agent level is a whole nother level of reporting, right? That's why it's at the bottom. Not to say that it is the least important, but it is the last step in this filter. It goes all the way from the top, and then it is eventually, hopefully, distributed to an agent, okay, if it is not abandoned before then. Agent level reporting, this is going to be if it is presented to an agent, right? So I am no longer looking at it as a CSQ call. I'm looking at it in the agent perspective. So if I were to look over here, the agent all fields report or the agent call summary report, I'm going to be looking at how many calls went to agent A, right? Let's call her Susan. How many calls went to Susan versus how many went to George, right? You're going to be able to see at the agent level how many calls went to each person. And this is also an important distinction, okay? Let's talk about calls presented for an example. You have calls presented to Susan, okay? Well, Susan was presented 5 calls, but Susan only handled 4. Okay, let's talk about that missing call. What happened to it? Well, that missing call rolled over to George. Now, George has 5 calls presented and 5 calls handled, which is awesome. High five to George. Let's talk about the total number of contacts coming in. It's very different, right? So if we have 9, let's say that is 9 calls to the CSQ, right? But we have 10 and 10 here with between Susan and George because it's the same contact that hit Susan that hit George. That it, hopefully people are following that, but I just wanted to point out the fact that it's a different level of reporting, and the totals, there are fields in there. You will be able to see RNA, which is the dirty word in a call center, right? Ring no answer. We have those fields available at the agent level, but just wanted to point out how the reports are a little bit different and why such a big deal about them being completely different levels of reporting. And this here example with the different applications is truly one example, right? And so if we look at the bottom example here, we are looking at more of a simpler, right, less complex organization that maybe has one 1-800 number. It comes into one application, and then it gets distributed from there into 2 different CSQs, right? And that's just very, very simple. We have one script. It does everything that we need. Okay, so a call comes in to UCCX, right? The system level report. We can still look at a system level. It's going to give us our totals, and we can still look at an application level, right? They're still different in their own way. Some of the differences here are that between these two here, I can have a total number of calls presented to my main menu application. And these three applications, the total may not necessarily equal what I get from my traffic analysis, right? They can be very different for a few different reasons. I can have numbers coming in specifically to each of them, but I can also have them calls going from one application to another. In an application summary report, have a specific, I can talk about this field, you have a specific field called flow in, flow out. How many calls came into this application but left the application before being handled by a CSQ or an agent? Okay, so you can have calls go between applications. In this example on the bottom, sample B, we have one application. This one application, right? We're not having calls go back and forth between different applications, so we truly have kind of a true total of calls coming into this application. Whereas looking at the total calls presented between main, sales, and service, it's going to give you a different view. It's going to be a little bit skewed, so to speak. So it's important to know and understand the architecture of your environment. And that is truly, I've been saying it, the basis for having this conversation is because I can speak with one of you, and it's a very different conversation to maybe the fourth person who joined this WebEx, because everybody's architecture is a little bit different. You may have 3 applications, and the next person sitting next to you might have 3 applications as well, and they're still going to report differently, right? Because you can have numbers coming in directly to it, but the person next to you has no numbers coming into you, and it's only transferred internally. So truly wanted to nail that one home there and understand that there are 2 different ways of looking at this. And over on the left, not going to read it for word here, but just kind of high levels out the differences, in granularity, right? One, sample A is a little bit more of a complex. Sample B, it's a little bit less complex, smaller organizations, and it allows you to look at things a little bit differently. So that in itself is how we look at CUIC architecture. Is we have calls in from the top, they go down and they go through the filter. They start at system level, they start at application level, and then we truly look at CSQ and agent level reporting. Now, I want to speak to different demographics that may be on this call, okay, and point out where some of these reports based on your environment, if you know what your environment is set up like and how this can be helpful to you. If you are a call center manager or supervisor that runs these reports maybe on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, whatever it is, you're getting into it, but you're truly from that call center background versus more of an IT level background. You're probably depending on where your focus is and what your architecture says. A lot of those resources would focus on CSQ and agent level reporting. For example, if you are strictly customer service, there are many applications on your system, but you really only look at customer service. You can definitely report on the service application, but you may not care about the sales application, right? So you can pull an application summary report to see what those numbers are, but really we would focus on how are my CSQs performing? And in order to understand that, you would also have within the CSQ level and the agent level, you would have summary reports and detailed reports. Okay. IT level reporting, if you are doing maybe some deep dive investigations on maybe there's a caller complaint, maybe something is just not reporting right. You have, for example, like we talked about earlier, a high number of calls in this queue that just doesn't make any sense. To really go and look at that, I would say definitely pull a traffic analysis, pull an application level report, truly understand the way that calls are being filtered down through your system as a whole. And that I will say as a just kind of to wrap it up there is some of what we would suggest as this is your architecture. And this is how to report on it based on the way that your environment is set up and based on your role. So with that, Rebecca, I think we can move to the next slide, which is questions. Before we get to questions, because we do have a couple more minutes here, I wanted to point out some of the reports that I've been kind of name dropping here. The first one you have is the traffic analysis, right? And if we can, you don't have to flip back, Rebecca, but just I have it up in front of me here. The system level reporting, right? And if you see what's on the screen here, I pulled one for last week for our environment. It's a total incoming calls. And truly what this is these are the total number of incoming calls by date that have hit my system, right? We have a lab system. It's very small. So as you can see here, we're not very busy. Ha, ha, ha. It's a lab. It's a lab for everyone looking at that. Wow, that's a really small number. Our traffic analysis shows, right, our lab environment data here. The total number of incoming calls averaged by hour, peak hour, right? What is the busiest hour of the day? I do want to make a note on this, right? Please keep in mind when looking at this report, because it is a really good report. It gives you, when is the heavy traffic coming in? Keep in mind, this is for the entire UCCX system, right? At the top of that brick that we showed you, UCCX system level reporting. So this is going to give you that entire view. You have average call durations, min, max, things like that. So this can be used for certain calculations, but just as long as you keep in mind that it is a system level report. I am going to see if I can click on this and click on the next, the application summary. Okay, your application summary report, this is going to give you a good understanding of how many calls went into each application, right? We're talking about just that secondary level, application level reporting. Here you can see in our demo in our lab, we have calls that come into our customer service main, right? And out of 29, 21 of them flowed out, right? The definition of flowed out being they went to another application, right? They came in and were presented to this application. They flowed out and went to another application. Within this too, at the application level, you're also going to get average speed of answer, average talk time, work time, how many of those calls abandoned, okay? And this is in the overall application. So these are not talking about abandoned at the CSQ level. Some of them may be at the CSQ level, but really we're looking at that application as a whole and everything included in that application under that umbrella. Click on here, and you could go and pull these as well if you have access. I always like to point out that in the top right of this, when you're pulling reports in CUIC, you always have this little question mark here. It's going to help give you the definition of some of these fields if that's helpful to you. Some of them are they're pretty straightforward, but if you needed, like I said, what is this exact calculation within the system, that help button is going to be helpful. At the CSQ level reporting, I gave you a couple of examples. One was a CSQ all fields. The other was this one that you see here, contact service queue activity report. By CSQ, it's going to give it by skill as well, which is, we have skills per CSQ. It's going to give you how many calls presented, your queue time, your max queue time, right? And I'm not going to read all of them, but it's going to give you that kind of average view versus a detail level report, which would give us record by record of every single call that came into that CSQ. Okay. This is a really good one if you're looking for things like calls DQ'd, right? Dropping that from earlier in the conversation. If you are taking notes and you're very curious to see what your organization has for DQ'd, go ahead and check out the CSQ, right? Contact Service Queue Activity Report. It's a good place to start. Right? And pressing the wrong button. There we go. The next one here is one of my favorites is the Agent All Fields report. This is going to be a good example of how your agents are performing. Please keep in mind, if you're looking at our stats here, this is a lab environment that we've taken screenshots from. But as you can see here, you have very quickly calls presented, handled. I have my logged in time, right? And truly from an all fields report, it's going to give you every data piece really that you need that's going to be associated with an agent. I have everything from my reserved time and through average talk time, the hold times. If if we keep scrolling over, you're going to get how many inbound IPCC versus non-IPCC, right? To get even more granular. An agent all field is truly going to give you the entire view per agent. So I will leave you with that, and I'm going to go back to the Q&A page, which I think is 1, 2, 3, 4. There we go. Because we are at almost the quarter to the hour here, and I will hand it back over to Rebecca for the Q&A, and we will open it up to the questions via the chat. So Rebecca is going to hand me chat questions from throughout the call.
And first, just again, housekeeping, if everybody can make sure they're back on mute. Had everybody on mute to start, but we are hearing some background noise from somebody. So we want to make sure just to be on mute for everybody so we can hear the questions. So Brittany, the first question comes from Priya. And the question is it not mandatory to DQ under the first queue loop before trying to transfer the call to another select resource? And this is probably more of a David question. Yes. David, if you're on, if you could take this one.
Yeah, so your specific configuration of your scripts really drive that. So if you're trying to nest one call in 2 different locations, so in other words, I'm sitting in the sales queue. After 5 minutes, you reach into or 2 minutes, you reach into the support CSQ. Now you have one call queuing in 2 locations. If the call was pulled from the originating sales queue and handled by support gets the credit for the handle. I'm getting a little feedback, Rebecca. I'm not sure if you hear that.
Yeah, I'm trying to mute everybody.
Then you can intentionally DQ that from the original CSQ. Now, by default, it should just automatically DQ. I know there's been different versions and different types of issues with 9 to 10 to 11 that's been a little bit of a discrepancy, but it depends on what version that should work. That will work fine.
Great, thank you. Hopefully, Priya, that answered your question. The next question comes from Jim Johnson. Do you have to mark a contact as handled when it's connected? He thought that it happened automatically. Do you have to DQ contact as well?
No, if you're talking about a select resource step under the connected branch, once an agent is connected to a caller, it's automatically marked as handled. Now, where we've seen discrepancies in the past is where a customer might have a ring no answer condition on a failed connect. They might send to a voicemail. They might do something different. At that point, even with a basic redirect, you're still going to want to, at that point, assign a DQ and a mark as handled by other or handled or whatever it might be in the event that an agent doesn't get that call.
David. The next, Patrick commented he didn't see the actual application summary report. And Patrick, I'm assuming that that's in your entire that you're looking at. That may be, and Brittany or David can correct me, but that might be rights restricted or due to your profile.
Yeah, or it depends what folder you're looking at. So if you're looking at the inbound folder, it's not in there. It's actually in the system report folder. So if you get into reports, stock, unified, UCCX historical, you'll have chat, email, inbound, multi-channel, outbound, and system. Application report is in system, not inbound.
Correct. And also to Rebecca's point, if you still don't see it there or you don't see that folder to begin with, it could be that your permissions do not allow for that view. So it's very dependent on your environment and permissions.
Question from SA. Should you run the traffic analysis report hours or during a slow period if you have a fairly large but multi-shared system?
That's a great question. So processor load is a critical thing for UCCX, and there are so many other contributing factors into that. I'll give you an example. If you're a 10Q company that has 50 agents with a decent amount of volume every hour, it's not the end of the world. But if you've had UCCX for 5 years and you're not really clean, or you haven't done like a cleanup of legacy configuration, you got to keep in mind that every configured queue and every configured agent that's in the system that gets served up to memory. So we've seen customers that have 100 agents and 50 queues, or 20 queues, or whatever it might be, but they have a giant processor load because they have so much legacy configuration. So in normal operating conditions, you should be fine. But if you're not, if your organization doesn't take that hygiene into effect and make sure that your UCCX is clean and proper, and deleted old agents, delete old CSQs, you could run into an issue where you're going to burn through a bunch of memory. And that leads to another question that a customer asked once not too long ago, is that what happens if you delete old CSQs and you need reports? Now, those reports are in there. So, once a report is written, for deleted CSQs, you'll still have access to those reports. We always recommend customers to stay on top of their configuration. And if you've got 5 years worth of information in there and only the last year is relevant, and just start, deleting old configuration, because that does get served up to memory. And there's a lot of agents that have to be processed, or a lot of configuration gets processed, and it's just a waste of resources.
Thank you, David. Next question coming in from Brian V. In your lab, are you using an app, synthetic calls, or is that report data generated by humans dialing?
It's a little bit of both. The way it depends on when those reports were written. We do have call simulators that we use to test CSQs and test scripts and things like that. I believe, Brittany, the report that you ran is recent, so those were most likely actual phone calls that we did for testing and just for this presentation.
The next two questions come from Johnson. If a call is delivered immediately, it never queues and therefore is not counted as a queued call CSQ report. Does it show up at all in the CSQ report?
The call is delivered immediately and never queues. So a call has to step through a select resource step. You're going to have an agent available. You'll have reserved time as part of the time that the phone is physically ringing is accounted for as reserved time. So it does step through. It does go to the connected branch, never hits the queue. So that won't show up as a queued call.
And then Jim's second question is, do old deleted CSQs ever age out of reports, or will they be present forever?
That just goes back to your UCCX purge cycles. We do recommend that customers take those purge cycles seriously, but that old data is in reports as long as your purge cycle is in place for your historical data. We have seen customers get to the point where they've kept information for 5 years. And it's just too much information, especially for 200-300 seat call centers. You got to be realistic about how often you purge, and every 2 years. I know call center managers like to keep everything. They're kind of like data hoarders.
Did we lose David?
Oh, sorry about that. I must have been.
You're back.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Not sure how that happened, but I was just saying the CSQ information will stay in the database up till you actually end up purging or using your purge cycles from your UCCX configuration.
Thank you. The next question is from Brian V. Which call simulator do you use?
Not sure. We'd have to talk to one of the technical people. I think we developed our own internally, but it's something that we'll reach out to the engineers and identify what they're using and can reply to the group. I believe we have pretty much everyone's emails.
The next message or question is from Shakib Ali Khan. If there is a dispute with the customer on who a call, is there a filter to view this on any of the reports?
Is the question on did the customer abandon or did the agent hang up? So if the question's on who abandoned, if it was specific to a caller ID, CCDR reports pretty much have everything in there that you can need. It tells you the whole path of every single phone call. If you look at your session IDs, it'll they're associated with a -0, -1, -2. And as the call, the CCDR reports pretty much tell that full story of what happens every leg of the call. So in other words, if a call comes in through handled by one agent and it's transferred to another queue that's handled by another agent, from sales to support to accounting, whatever it might be, you'll have that in the CCDR reports. And Brittany, keep me honest on that. It's the CCDR report that will track the session IDs with the legs, right?
Yes, yep, that's correct. And I do want to branch on that as well, because I think the way that I'm interpreting this question is can we tell who hung up first? So to your point, David, yes, the CCDR report, it is a detail level record that will give you those session legs, right? Who transferred what, when, where did it go? Was it the disposition? Was it handled? Was it abandoned? So that right there, the disposition will tell you, was it an abandoned call? An abandoned call in the system is defined as the customer hung up all before getting to an agent. If you are asking, can we report in CUIC on hung up and disconnected that contact first, that is something that unfortunately is not available because it's already at the agent. So it's a live call. That information would live, I would assume, in a log in CUCM, but I can't speak to that. I know that it is not that specific question, who hung up the call first after they've been connected, does not live in CUIC.
One question that's been asked by several, and so I wanted to answer it as a whole, is will this session be the recording be provided after the fact? It will. We are recording the session and we will provide it via a WebEx link through our Cisco partnership. They will be sending that out. And then the other question that was asked is to provide this presentation out, and we will do that as well. We will email this out to the list of attendees. So I wanted to cover that as a whole. Carpio asked, abandoned can be if the customer hung up even during the greeting or in the menu prompts?
Yes. An abandoned contact, and it depends again on which level you're reporting as. If you have a CSQ abandoned call, it is going to be abandoned the CSQ, which means that I have been holding. I have decided, oh, I'm, pulling up to the drive-through as a good example is I'm in queue, but now I don't want to be rude to the person at the window, so I'm going to hang up and call back later. Another example is I'm going VR, right? Before I get to the CSQ, I can also abandon at that level. And I will remind you that that is an application level report that you would look at that statistic on.
Shakib asking if we could go up to the slide, talk about scenario 3, slide 3, and talk about scenario 3. So this is where we're at. Shakib, do you want to unmute and talk about that? That's the question. I think I've got Hari Prasad unmuted.
Let's go ahead and mute them, Rebecca.
I will. Shakib, do you want to unmute? I cannot. I can't get him to mute. Sorry, it won't mute.
Okay.
Sorry, just a second.
I'll let me speak to scenario 3, right? Call presented to CSQ1.
Just a second. Just a second. Let me.
Depends, ఇవన్నీ మార్చేస్తావా
I am not able to do anything with that user. I will. Okay. Shakib, let me know if that answers your question. I think, let's see. Tony says, none of those scenarios account for a call in 2 queues at once, right? If dequeuing first and then being second queue.
Correct. So if a call comes in and immediately nests for 2 different queues, and the second queue answers the phone call, the first queue will be set to DQ. So in Q1, call comes in, and let's say 30 seconds later, you nest it because of time and agent availability, queues for Q2. You have 1 call queuing in 2 places. So if you kind of think back to that application level report, now it looks like you've got 2 calls in there, you know, on how you kind of pull it in. And the scripting, again, will drive this. You could either mark it so that it's DQ'd and handled by the second one, the first one handled by the second one, or for abandons, you can mark them both as abandoned. So you end up with 2 calls presented, 2 calls abandoned. So again, this is where it's critical, and we're a little bit over on time here. So this is where it's critical that we look at the scripting piece of this. You have the ultimate control of how you mark these calls, depending on how you need to report, for staffing purposes and reporting out. So DQ'd is going to be something that's taken pretty seriously because it means it's handled by other or DQ'd and abandoned. It's done something different. So It's critical that you factor this conversation into the way things are scripted. It's probably kind of a vague answer because it really boils down to how your system is scripted.
Okay. With that, I'm going to go ahead and end the session. We did have at the end, if you have any further questions, please feel free to forward those to us at info@workflowconcepts.com. And we'd be happy to answer any further inquiries through that channel. And meanwhile, I hope you'll all join us next week for our second in the series, our second installment, and hope you have a great weekend. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.